How to Be an Artist, Step 30, The Home of the Future, with guest Michael Eliason. All right, Mike Eliason, welcome to How to Be an Artist.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so the reason I wanted to have you on today was mostly because of your interest in Baugrouping, and that's something I wanted to explore a little bit. But as I kind of like read more of your writing, you're kind of one of these guys that like you have kind of these several interests that all kind of like intersect, and it's really kind of fun to see like that area of exploration of like the intersection. So hopefully as we talk today, we can talk about decarbonization, mass timber zoning and stuff like that, and how they all come together in the places where we live. But to start out, I wanted to start with Baugrouping. And the reason I'm interested in this is this idea that kind of the world we live in, which includes like our housing and also like our culture, really shapes like what is possible, how we can live our lives, what options are open to us. And so I'm very curious about this idea of how alternative forms of housing, and I mean alternative in relation to how we live now, because a lot of these alternative, quote unquote, alternative forms are ways humans have lived for thousands of years. But I'm interested in how we change, housing, how we change the physical shape of our land use, and how that can affect like what's possible. So I wanted to talk with you particularly about Baugrouping. And maybe we can start with kind of an explanation of what it is and what you see that it does, and what problems you see that it solves.
Yeah, so Baugrouping kind of developed in mostly around Berlin, but also kind of simultaneously in a number of other German cities. And it's effectively people who I would say are more middle class, who started to see that they were getting priced out of the city. Urban areas tend to be very difficult, I think, for families, right? Like they're dominated, by singles and couples. And so I think it really became an opportunity for people to come together and basically self-develop their own non-market housing. And so it's become this method of building, as you said, alternative forms of housing. And so it's alternative in the guise that it's not a single family house or a studio apartment, right? So these are, multi-generational, varied unit sizes. It's old and young living together. It's really about kind of building these communities so that you have the support, in a city. And they're not all family oriented. In fact, there are a number that aren't. But for me, I'm a parent. We have two kids. It's really an opportunity to kind of, for us to, a model to build this lifestyle where we're kind of surrounded by people we know and people that can support us and people that, we can support. In a lot of ways, it's about kind of solidarity and just living in community. And so that's really what drew me to it when I was working in Germany.
Yeah, that's I've definitely noticed that issue. We tried to move closer to the city probably about 10 years ago. But one thing that's like very, very obvious is even like, I think this is the case in a lot of cities in America, it's mostly single family housing, and so that's like very expensive and getting more expensive every day. And so there's not an opportunity for like young families to like move into the city. I mean, like you say, it's like singles, renting increasingly tiny apartments, or people kind of holding on to like whatever they have, or people with more money kind of moving into the city. So yeah, that's very interesting. Now, is it in some ways, it seems like it's kind of very similar to, there is a tradition of like cooperative housing and co-housing in the United States. How do you kind of like, what's the similarity between those? Is there any differentiation in any way
Yeah.
with them to you?
Yeah, co-housing to me is uh, it's something that I admire. We have a number of friends who live in co-housing communities. I would say for the most part, co-housing in the U.S. has been more of a suburban or rural
Mm,
venture rather than urban. That's slowly changing. There's a um, Schemata, Mike Mariano and Grace Kim built a urban co-housing project here in Seattle. There are a couple in Berkeley. There's a couple in Portland. But for the most part, co-housing projects in the U.S. have been uh, outside of the urban core of the city, and they've also been relatively homogenous, right? So a lot of them, you're still buying into community, and so you need to, have wealth. It's We don't have financing set up to really,
mm.
support these kinds of communities. So they tend to be, the word is NORC, naturally occurring retirement community.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
so I look at Baugruppen in Germany, which tend to be a lot more diverse in kind of age of residents versus co-housing in the U.S. Like I said, that's changing. We definitely need better financing options, and it's the same with cooperatives. We don't have a lot of cooperatives here in Seattle. The model that we're looking at developing would actually be a cooperative. That's also related to zoning and our really awful condo laws here in Washington State. But the other thing with cooperatives though is you're not developing that community. You're kind
Mm,
of you're buying into a community that has a maybe a specific set of values. And so that's one of the issues or one of the benefits of Baugruppen is for the most part you're designing your home with the people that you're going to live with, and so it's kind of a democratic in a way that cooperative really isn't, at least for the first residents that live there.
yeah, gotcha. So in the sense, it's kind of like the cooperative. You have people that kind of start the cooperative, and they kind of establish what the values are or what how it's going to be built, and then everyone else has to kind of like buy in as they kind of like enter into the cooperative.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, I've had a few discussions with some people that work within cooperatives, and it sounds like it's very unusual nowadays for people for new construction to be part of the model. So a lot of cooperatives in the United States now are like pre-existing cooperatives, like a lot in New York,
Yep.
or it's like converting rentals or like trailer parks into cooperatives. But yeah, you talk about financing, and that's like such a big part of the equation. And yeah, financing for cooperatives, as I've talked with you about cooperatives, it's really complicated, and it sounds like not a lot of banks like are familiar with it or want to be involved with it. So I mean, is there something different with how it works in Germany? Is it just a familiarity, or are there like specific products or policies that help support it in Germany?
There is definitely much more support in Germany. So there are environmentally conscious development banks, and so they exist solely to fund construction, and a lot of them are environmentally focused or socially focused. And so Baugruppen are really a way of hitting a number of those things, right? So Germany already has really advanced energy codes versus most of the U.S., but there are incentives effectively to be even more efficient. So one of the programs is the KfW Bank. They've got, I think it's up to $100,000 per homeowner
Hmm.
towards, that you can use. It's a low interest
Wow.
loan towards, energy efficiency measures. And so one of the things that in people that we've talked to that are doing co-ops in Baugruppen, they're able to use those funds essentially as their seed money, right, for part of the construction financing. Um, there are a number of cooperative banks that will offer low interest rates. Other incentives. There are a bunch of cities that hold land for Baugruppen.
Hmm.
So the city of Tübingen and Vauban held competitions for their really big parcel or their really big development projects that were 40-50% Baugruppen. And so it became
Wow.
like a values oriented thing rather than a who can come up with the most money for this plot of land, right? Which is kind of the standard operating procedure here in the US. And so you would get these really, wonderful projects. We're going to be half retirees, half refugees, right? So these super innovative buildings that people can kind of come together and build and live in community. The city of Hamburg has been very supportive of Baugruppen. They have procurement incentives for it. Vienna is kind of becoming a Baugruppen hotspot, and Vienna's everything in Vienna, like in the building scale, is taken up to kind of a big step versus a lot of what we're seeing here in the U.S. And so they've got, 6, 8, 10-story, 50, 60, 70 unit Baugruppen that are just phenomenal and just the most incredible amenities. Huge bike rooms, workout
Wow.
spaces, libraries, saunas. I mean, it's unbelievable.
Yeah, that sounds pretty interesting. So, I mean, I guess the other barrier to kind of look at is like the zoning barrier. I wonder if you could kind of speak on like how that's kind of complicates things. And I know you look at that a lot within Seattle. So I guess you could speak to like Seattle in particular, but I think it probably applies to a lot of the rest of the U.S. too.
Yeah, so Seattle, as with most major cities in the U.S., is largely dominated by single-family zoning. The city council in the last couple of years has kind of loosened it a little bit so that you can build. At first, it was one ADU. Now it's an ADU and a backyard cottage. So conceivably, you could get up to 3 units per lot. But single-family zoning makes up somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of a city, depending on whether you're looking at total acres or total buildable
Hmm.
parcels. And so you really can't build multifamily housing in most of the city. And then where you can build multifamily housing, again, the regulations are very, very difficult. A lot of it is slammed up on arterials. And so, as a
Mm.
father with 2 kids and the
Yeah.
people that we want to live with, right, we don't have any desire to live on an arterial. And so I think there's two parts of this. One is we need to look. There's no single family zoning in Europe.
Mm.
There's none in Germany. Um, and so there is a lot more diversity in housing, right? There's duplexes next to, large social housing complexes next to, you know, single family homes next to 6, 8, 10 unit apartments, right? Like there's this wonderful diversity in housing versus this, I would say not so healthy monoculture of
Oh yeah.
detached house after detached house. And in an area that's growing, we need to find ways to insert, housing. I think it needs to be more affordable. And so the land use component is a huge issue in our city. It's really a huge issue in every North American city. It's not just the U.S. Canada is having, the exact same discussions. And I'm not really sure what the solution is. It's part of me is like, let's just get rid of zoning. Uh,
Yeah.
Form-based codes, I don't think are any better. It's kind of like this hybrid between zoning and people's weird aesthetic inclinations. Uh,
Are
so
those kind of too restrictive in a completely other way that you're saying things need to?
a little bit, right? A lot of the form-based codes in the U.S. have these really weird requirements on building heights and setbacks and window proportions, and it's just that's this isn't how we build cities, right? Like that's
Yeah.
the regulations on building here in the U.S. are significantly uh, more strenuous than they are in Germany. Our land use and zoning codes here and our building ordinances, several thousand pages, right? Like
Yep.
it's not conducive to building affordably or building at the scale that we really need to.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there's definitely an argument to be made for like when you talk about regulation and building, there's an argument to be made for like, yeah, let's make sure things are safe, right? But like, look at all these beautiful cities around the world that where there was no zoning that led to their development, and it like clearly has not been that big of a need for and through much of human history. But you also post some really beautiful on your Medium blog. You have an article specifically about like I guess what they call missing middle housing in Germany, and you just see all the stuff kind of right next to each other, and it's all like lovely looking stuff too. I mean, I think that's kind of the key. Um, what do you think about like kind of the approaches of places like is it Minnesota and Oregon and their kind of moves towards like zoning reform?
I think that they're they're not as permissive as I would like to see,
Uh huh.
and so Portland had an interesting thing where they're allowing more units on a single family lot if the units are affordable. And I
Mm,
can't remember what the ratio. I think it was 2 of the 6 have to be affordable to under 60 or 80% AMI. So it was something like that. Um,
hmm
but it's still very much driven by a form that's designed to be compatible with detached houses. And so what we're
Yeah.
saying is that the detached house is prominent. We'll let people live here, but we're going to limit the housing to be in scale in a manner that may not necessarily, again, be conducive to building, community or community oriented housing or affordably. So it's using legislation to address problems that are, I think, much more systemic, right? Like it's not just land use; it's financing. It's
Hmm.
like all of these other things. So
Yeah, yeah, that's a really good point, and that's one thing that I think gets missed a lot is even if you fix the zoning, there's still like this financing that's very embedded with the single family home, and it knows how to do that. And any type of innovation, financing is not kind to innovation with housing or probably of any kind, right?
yeah, no, the funding issue is I think even it's probably even more severe than the land use. Like we can push cities on the land use side, and I think we're even Biden with his latest proposal is looking at incentivizing right carrots to eliminate exclusionary zoning. So
Mm,
there are paths to that, but even if we eliminate exclusionary zoning, like if we don't develop kind of these socially or environmentally conscious development banks, cooperative banks, right? Like
mm,
does that is there space for things like power group and co-ops to exist in those areas? And I think that
mm,
there are, but it's going to take a lot of conversations. Like our conversation for our project, we've been talking to a local credit union who has started to fund community land trusts,
hmm.
and so they're so maybe with local banks there could be a possibility for doing something, but on a large scale, right? Like it would be great to have a national nonprofit or even government owned bank that was set up to fund these kinds of projects.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's kind of been my experience too. As I have conversations with like small local lenders, they seem like the most willing to kind of take chances on more unusual type projects.
Hmm.
Which I think like a lot of the small scale developers, like I don't know if you're familiar with like John Anderson and like the incremental development type thing. They do a lot of that because those are the people that are willing to do kind of more unusual stuff. Anyway, I wanted to move on and talk about some of the. I mean, maybe we can come back and cover some of this stuff, but yeah, I want to talk a little bit about kind of building materials and mass timber. And I'm wondering like where to start. You kind of made this comment about like how this is just becoming standard in Europe right now. So maybe you can just kind of give an introduction to like Passivhaus and mass timber and how they kind of work together.
Yeah, so Passivhaus is this ultra low energy standard that was developed by Wolfgang Feist, who's a German physicist, and Bo Adamson, who was a Swedish, I think, civil engineer in the 90s. A lot of it, though, is based on building science principles that were forged in the US and Canada. And so what it is you're effectively optimizing the thermal shell of a building, and so that's eliminating thermal bridges, and that's where you have kind of like this direct connection between inside and outside, where heat or cooling are kind of expedited through the envelope because there's no insulation to kind of
Mm,
restrict that flow. And what this leads to moisture issues, condensation problems, mold, eventual building failure, stuff like that. So it's kind of addressing addressing the rate of which your energy is leaking out of the building, utilizing triple pane windows, and what you get is like this big, we call it a thermos, right? So you've got this thermos, it's comfortable inside, whether it's hot or cold, but you need ventilation, right? Well, you can't just poke a hole because, especially as we've seen lately, right, the air outside isn't the healthiest,
mm-hmm,
especially if you live near a highway, which a lot of our multifamily is, or if you live in a place where it's super smoky for part of the year. And so what they do is they instead of an exhaust fan in your bathroom uh, with trickle vents in your windows, is this kind of self-contained unit. It's a HRV, heat recovery ventilator. What that does is it brings in the fresh air, and as it's bringing in the fresh air, that fresh air is filtered. It kind of it commingles, not adjacent to the air that's simultaneously being exhausted. that exhaust air has moisture in it. It's got heat in it. So there are units that are able to collect a portion of that heat. And some of them are super efficient, like 90, 92, 95% efficient.
Wow.
And some units are able to also capture some of the moisture. So right in winter, when the air is dry, you're basically able to moisturize the air as it comes in. So it's not coming in dry and causing, additional problems in the house. So it's kind of this way of providing fresh air and even temperatures, and kind of, this high quality, comfortable interior. And so that developed in Europe in the early 90s. Over time, they've gotten really good at working with manufacturers and industry and kind of developing the components that are needed for it. So, better insulation, triple pane windows, airtight tapes and stuff, similar components like that. But simultaneous with that is the EU has been very, very aggressively increasing the energy efficiency requirements of their buildings. So, more insulation in your envelope, better performing windows, requirements for HRV. And so in the latest iteration, they have it just started this year. So this year, the end of last year, is that kind of all new construction needs to basically be at or close to Passivhaus, right? And they call it the
Oh, wow.
nearly zero energy buildings.
So do they have a standard in a lot of Europe? They have a standard. Is it explicitly passive house, or is it just kind of like a de facto passive house standard because it's so close to it anyway?
It's not quite Passivhaus. It's a little bit less stringent than Passivhaus.
Hmm.
But what and that's a kind of so it's the EU, right? So it's
Okay.
every nation is supposed to be there at this point.
Hmm.
The local jurisdictions can go beyond it though, right? So they can mandate more energy efficiency for construction, right? So let's say we're going to upzone this parcel here. That's fine. We're going to mandate that all the buildings have to meet Passivhaus or be Passivhaus. And so there's a lot of things that the cities can do that kind of have helped power the movement as well. So the city of Brussels in the by the 90s had like the worst thermal insulation requirements in all of Europe. I can't remember the exact year. I want to say like 2005 or 2000. Yeah, I think it was like 2005. They decided that they were going to mandate basically passive house levels of construction a decade before the EU was going to mandate it. And so what they did was they offered incentives to
Hmm.
developers. They funded training for builders and the trades. They promoted the hell out of it. They trained all of their city staff on what it entailed, and it's really become this epicenter where there are just an incredible number of buildings that meet Passivhaus, and they've been doing it, for years and years and years now. And there's not really a premium to do it anymore. Everyone kind of knows how to do it. The architects know how to design to it.
The inertia's there
Yeah,
now.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And so it's just become the way they build, right? And so as an architect who has worked in Europe, right, it's just even that floors me. And so similarly with mass timber. So mass timber was developed in Austria, Germany, Switzerland, probably 25 years ago. Uh, is the glulam has been available in Europe for decades, but what really kicked off the mass timber movement were two components. Brechstaple, which is dowel laminated timber. Imagine taking like a 2x4 or 2x6 board, kind of ganging them all up to form like one big floor or wall component, and then
Yeah.
they stick dowels in it, and so you have this big solid wood element. So there's DLT, and then there's CLT, cross laminated timber, and that's kind of taking your 2x4s, laying them down flat, glue 2x4 layer above that going the opposite direction, glue layer 2x4 going in the opposite direction again. So it's kind of like plywood, right? Like if you look at the videos
Yeah.
of plywood,
But like a giant piece of plywood made
yeah,
out of 2x4s.
exactly. So, 4 inches to, I think the largest I've seen is 11, 12 inches for, 8, 9, 10 story buildings. And so the government has pushed it. There's been a lot of innovation on the industry side. There's a ton of research. I mean, they are decades ahead of where we are.
And what is like the benefits of mass timber? Like maybe talk about how that is different from what we're doing right now, in the US mostly.
Yeah. So I think that there are a couple of big things. One is the environmental discussion, right? So everyone talks about the sequestration of mass timber. I'm a little bit leery on those, having seen LCAs.
Hmm.
A lot of it has to do with sourcing. So FSC or SFI is, I think, the Canadian. It's not quite as stringent as the FSC, but it's similar.
It's like Forest Stewardship Council, right?
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's, they have these regulations on how often and what kind and what type of species can be harvested, and tracking the chain of custody and everything else, so that we're not clear cutting huge
Hmm.
swaths of land to build buildings. So the end of use component plays a lot. So whether it's landfilled, or the reality is a lot of these panels, after they've been around for 80, 100, 200 years, whatever, will probably end up being burned for energy. So it's the sourcing of the wood and the end of life has a huge effect on whether we should be counting the carbon sequestration and how much. So I'm still a little bit leery on that information.
Hmm.
But the environmental one is a big part of the conversation here in the U.S. and also in Germany. Prefabrication, quiet job sites, clean job sites. You can put together an 8-story building in 8, 9, 10 days. Um, the biophilic component, right? Wood is attractive to look at. CLT is airtight, so it's really good for Passivhaus.
And what type of materials is it replacing? Does this replace like concrete, steel? Like, because I know they're doing like some high rises with like mass timber.
Yeah, so it's a substitute for, in my mind, yeah, concrete buildings, steel buildings. In the U.S., I think we have a couple of really tall buildings that are in the works. Our codes are not quite as progressive as Europe, and so they're not solid mass timber the whole way up.
Hmm.
Norway, Mjøstarnet was this huge, I want to say it's 18, 19-story mass timber building that was built super quick, prefabricated, and it doesn't have a concrete core, and it doesn't use CLT for the floors. It only used the CLT for the elevator shafts. And so you get like these tall buildings with a vast amount of exposed wood on the interior.
Is it how much like steel? Is there like some sort of steel reinforcing going into those as well? Or
Uh,
um,
yeah, so it's Starnet is built a little bit like we would build a steel building, but it's
mm,
using big, massive wood components as beams and columns and cross bracing, and then all of the connections, of course, are steel.
okay, yeah, that is just like so wild. So rather than usually it's like you've got a lot of structural I don't know what you call them, structural elements that are basically like steel, like with concrete around them, right? And then
Yep,
you kind of like build on top of that normally. So this is like primarily wood for an 18-story building,
yep.
which is pretty crazy. Yeah, I was really I had first time I'd heard about DLT was you did like a presentation for like what is it called, Mass Timber March Madness,
Hmm.
and the DLT stuff is super interesting to me too. And I guess there's also an additional benefit with that there's like less because you don't have the glues and stuff. I don't know. Is there a benefit for that as far as you were talking a little bit like about disassembly or mentioning like disassembly. Like how does that all work as far as like the end of life of buildings, what happens with buildings when they decline, when they do need to be torn down, or just when there's like natural deterioration.
Yeah, so DLT comes in. It's a panel 4, 6, 8 inches thick by 8 feet wide and 40 feet long ish. Um, they come in these long panels. They can be chucked into place really easily. They're screwed or fastened down to whatever the substructure is. So the project that we used them on here in Seattle, we had a glulam column and beam frame, and it just sits on top of it. Uh, the DLT doesn't. It's not as good on spans as cross laminated timber is,
Hmm.
and it's also not airtight. So uh,
Uh,
it's a little bit tricky if you're going to do like a cantilever through your envelope with DLT. But if you're not using it as your airtight membrane, so if you're going to throw plywood or OSB over it, you can tape those seams, and it's just as effective. Uh, Personally, I find DLT more attractive.
hmm.
um, it's the fine grainness, I think, that I'm kind of drawn to. CLT, the boards are flatter,
Mm.
and so you're getting a different face exposed. But
Yeah.
they're both can be. I've seen buildings that are super beautiful utilizing either.
Yes, because the DLT is like you're seeing the ends of the lumber, right?
Exactly,
And they're kind of like
exactly.
all stacked together, and you'll see like little gaps or something between them. Yeah, there's some cool pictures on your Medium if you go check those out. I want to go back just 1 second. I was going to ask some more questions about Passivhaus,
Yeah,
just to clarify some things. So one thing, when I start mentioning like Passivhaus to other people, most people just automatically are like kind of start thinking about like LEED,
yeah.
and they're like, oh, it's like LEED, right? So maybe you could talk about how those are different, just to like clarify that. And then I have another question about Passivhaus after that. But
Yeah,
go ahead.
so Passive House really only looks at energy consumption. It's
Mm,
the three requirements are on the there's a limit on how much heat you can have or cooling depending on your climate to heat or cool your building. There's a overall max that you're allowed to get for your building, and that's basically the that limit is the energy consumption of that building on site multiplied by a source factor. And what the source factor does is it penalizes dirty grid. So if you're in a carbon intensive area, your source, or sorry, if you're in like a coal intensive
uh,
energy mix, your source factor is going to be higher. And so to meet that limit, right, your total energy consumption has to be a lot lower. If you're in an area that is renewables heavy, your source factor is going to be a lot lower. And so it uses kind of the grid, right, to kind of optimize the energy consumption a little bit. And then the third component of it is your building has to meet an airtightness level of zero point 0.6 air changes per hour at 50 pascals. What that means is
yeah,
that your building is completely closed up. They stick a little uh, fan in your door, and then they overpressurize and depressurize your building to 50 pascals. And it has to basically not allow a certain amount of air in. And if it doesn't allow that much air in, then you're a passive house with
yeah.
those three elements. Uh, Most passive house architects I know aren't just interested in the efficiency side. They're very, I would say almost everyone I know was doing lead, felt that lead wasn't doing anything on the energy side, right? And,
Yeah.
you get a point for a bike rack. That's great. But, how, why is there a massive amount of air leakage in my lead building? And so, they were already focused on things that lead is important on. So where your materials come from, are they recyclable? What is the recycling content? Is it adjacent to transit? Right. So everyone I know in the passive house community is, wrestling with these questions. But the passive house component is like a tried and true method, right? So it's like we know if we design a passive house that we're not going to exceed the amount of energy that we need, which to heat and cool it, which means that our building will require less energy, which entails less, carbon emissions over the life cycle of the building. Okay, that's great. Now we're going to focus on the decarbonizing our building, right? So,
Cool.
is it mass timber instead of concrete? Can we use, ultra low embodied carbon elements for insulation? So cellulose, which is recycled newspaper, Holzfaser, which is basically like wood grain that's ground down really fine from wood waste in the wood fabrication component or in the process. There's all of these, this cork insulation. There are all of these different components that passive house folks have been using and experimenting with for at this point for 2 decades now, because they're already they're already interested in addressing the energy side, and so now that they got that part figured out, they can focus on the rest.
Yeah, it seems like it kind of makes sense to like just separate those two things rather than having some sort of like certification that's giving you points for all sorts of kind of, I mean, good things that we want in our buildings. They're kind of a little bit unrelated, and makes sense to kind of like look at them as separate problems, right? To have like, okay, let's look at like air tightness and heating and cooling, and then look at like embodied carbon as like a different problem to solve. One of the other things I was interested in with Passivhaus, just to give people a sense of how it functions, once it's kind of built and set up, what are like the heating and cooling needs compared to like I don't know, regular construction, whatever that means.
Yeah, so the requirements for heating a passive house or cooling it are really, really low. So low that they like to say you could basically use a hair dryer as your heater. Right, and so the original documentation, right, that's kind of what they show as your heating element. So a lot of people are using heat pumps. The issue with the heat pumps is they're all oversized, really, for at least on
Mm,
the smaller scale. So the small multifamily or single family house, right, the heat pumps are even oversized for a passive house. But it's kind of the easy way to do it, and you get heating and you get cooling. A lot of people are trying to get off fossil fuels completely in the passive house community. So,
hmm
elimination of our boiler and everything else. I don't know how to quantify it. Maybe in economic terms, the folks I
I want
know.
a number. I want a
Yeah.
dollar per month.
So I have to go back and look at my own notes in the past, but I'm trying to think of passive house projects that I've looked at recently. Their total energy bills have been like, 20, $30 a month. And they're heating, half the year they're not using heating or cooling at all. And then when they need it,
Mm.
it's maybe 10, $15 a month. It's incredibly low.
But is this one of these cases where it really makes sense? I mean, where the multifamily really comes into this as well, where like the heat pumps make more sense with like a larger unit, right? And obviously, there's efficiencies that come from having like larger and, as you've said before, boxier units, right?
There are heat pump options for multifamily buildings. They're not as prevalent here in the U.S. as they are in other locations, but they're definitely starting to pick up. The reality is the heating demand on a multifamily passive house is probably too low even for a heat pump, right? So
Hmm.
you could just put in a electric resistance mat in the bathroom, maybe one post heater somewhere in your ventilation system that just uses resistance heat, and that would be adequate for a multifamily building.
Oh wow!
Yeah.
And then for cooling, what does cooling look like? Is that just about like kind of passive ventilation, something like that?
So the cooling part is a little bit harder. In a lot of the U.S., we build double loaded corridors, and so it's not possible to get
Hmm.
ventilation, cross ventilation through your building. A lot of European buildings are not double loaded corridor, so you get the cross ventilation, you get night cooling. In some places in the U.S., you can't do night cooling at all, right? Like it's too hot, too
Yeah,
humid.
that's the case where we are here.
Yeah, so then you probably are looking at like an additional. Your first strategy is to keep the heat out, right? So external shades to prevent that summer sun from kind of overheating your place. But over time, as it gets warmer, you're gonna need to add cooling in your building. So yeah, probably a mini split heat pump they're super efficient for cooling. No, I mean, I would say the biggest issues are, and I think as the world is increasingly getting warmer, we're going to need to address that even more. A lot of folks in the community, in the passive house community, like to stress test their passive house, and so they'll take the energy model, and you can modify the weather to be warmer and kind of see how it performs as the world increases in temperature. And so uh, the heating, I think, over time is going to become less and less dominant versus cooling, which will become more and more dominant. But we are going to have issues where it's going to be incredibly cold
Hmm.
for these extended periods, like we saw in Texas this year, where they're not really geared up for these massive cold snaps. Uh,
Yeah.
People were freezing within. They had no ability to heat their home, and most of those homes don't have insulation, and so immediately they were kind of overcome by how unresilient that housing stock is.
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of comes into this issue of like the decentralization, having kind of these centralized grids or gas supply, whatever, that those things break down and you have a lot of very, very vulnerable people all of a sudden without any other options. One of the other things I want to kind of ask about while we're talking about like passive house in mass timber is just like the cost. Like what is the there? I'm pretty sure there's a premium to build these ways. What's the cost to do these things versus like other construction costs right now?
So the mass timber side is a little bit in flux. Right now, the cost of lumber is through the roof,
Yeah, that's
and
right.
so that I think is starting to affect projects. In Europe, the cost of mass timber is effectively at parity with typical construction. There may be like a 1 or 2%
Hmm.
cost
Hmm.
premium, and there are ways to mitigate that cost as well. A large part of it is they have the infrastructure to deal with it. They've got a lot of experience with it. A lot of times in the U.S., there's a cost premium because contractors have never used it. They're
Hmm.
not familiar with it, and so there's added risk that they have to build in. I would say the other thing too is we're not very good at optimizing our mass timber buildings
Hmm.
in the U.S. And so they're maybe a little bit over-engineered, or there could be ways to
Uh,
reduce the amount of fiber in the building, which would bring the cost down. On a couple of projects that I've been working on, we've worked really hard to kind of optimize that fiber so that we're meeting noise protection requirements, but that we're not, adding more wood and cost than we need.
what do you mean when you say fiber there?
Yeah, so like if you think about the span, let's say a panel of a building, right? And so if
Hmm.
it's 3 ply, we'll say it's 4.5 inches thick. If it's 5 ply, it's 6.5 inches thick, right? So if you have a panel that's 8 foot wide by 40 feet long, by 4.5 inches thick, right? That's a third or less wood fiber in that panel than if it was the 5 ply,
Gotcha.
right? So the additional fiber increases you're paying for the material and the fabrication process, so it increases the cost of the building.
I was wondering, is part of the cost issue involved at all with like local sourcing for timber? I mean, is the timber in Europe, is the supply chain different in Europe than it is in the U.S., or is it kind of the same, all the same like system or supply chain?
I think it's a little bit different in Europe. There are I want to say the location of the forests maybe makes it a little bit easier. Everything's closer in Europe too,
Mm.
right? So they're not having to truck panels long distances. We don't have that many, mass timber fabricators like in the South right now, right? But there are a couple coming online. Walmart is heavily invested in mass
Oh,
timber,
really?
oddly
That's
enough,
interesting.
and so they're building a plant in Arkansas for their new headquarters. Texas, I think, has a couple of plants, and a lot of the European mass timber, especially the CLT fabricators, are starting to make inroads to the U.S. as well. So it's definitely uh, it's definitely picking up momentum. But I think the lack of suppliers has definitely played a cost as well.
Yeah, so it's you're saying that it's there's starting to be more in the South. So where are most of the fabricators like currently in the U.S.?
So I would say most of them are probably here in the Northwest.
Okay,
We've
that
got
makes sense.
a bunch in BC. There are two in Oregon. I think there are two. There's at least one. No, there are two in Washington. We've got one or two more that are coming online soon. The on the East Coast, Canada has a couple. Canada has been really, really pushing, CLT for a while. Economic incentives. BC has their wood first policy. So the mass timber industry in Canada has really, really kicked off much faster, I think, than ours has. Although the
Hmm.
U.S. as a whole is starting to, especially I think on the West Coast, see quite a tidal wave here. So
That's cool. Yeah, I'm just like I'd love to see some of that stuff happen more locally. It just seems like really interesting stuff. Oh yeah, the other thing, while I'm thinking about it, I wanted to ask if you'd had any experience like using like as far as air sealing for Passivhaus, like using like the aero barrier system. You familiar with this?
yeah, so I haven't used it. My Baugruppe partner Aaron Yankauskis, who worked for developers for a long time and is now trying to basically make a business model that Baugruppen and co-ops are better for the environment. He loves this stuff, and
Uh-huh.
the issue so far has been I haven't found a Passivhaus certifier that will sign off on it,
Oh, interesting.
and so that's been the hang up. Me personally, like I prefer just taping the exterior sheathing. and seams. But there are issues with that as well. But Aaron loves that stuff, man. You can dial it in, and I think with all the Passivhaus certifiers we've talked to, it's really a question of longevity.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering about. So, I mean, the reason I bring that up was I did a renovation on our house a couple years ago now, and
Hmm.
it's like a 1950s like brick Rambler, and our architect is a guy that's certified Passive House. And initially, I was like, "Hey, could you make this thing Passive House?" And he's like, "Yeah, that's probably not going to happen."
Yeah.
But it was pretty funny. Kind of about halfway through the project, I like saw this YouTube video about aero barrier, and the project was at a point where it's like it was feasible, and so we did the aero barrier. And just to explain what it is for those that are listening, it's like it like pressurizes the house, and then you like mist this like caulk into the air, and the pressure like pushes it into all the cracks, the exterior cracks, to seal it. And I can't remember the exact number, but like for an old like leaky house like ours, like I mean the final number was at least pretty good. I wish I had the number on hand so I could look it up, but I think it's kind of interesting as far as like retrofitting, potentially what you can do with it. But I had that same question about longevity. Is it something that kind of like gives a really cool effect right when you run it, but over time is going to kind of like deteriorate, fall out of the cracks, that type of thing?
Yeah, no,
So,
the tapes are relatively durable, and then we tend to bury those in insulation anyway, so there's kind of this redundant layer
hmm.
on the tapes and the membranes. But it's a big question of ours right now as we struggle with are we going to do aero barrier, is that feasible, or are we just going to do tapes and membranes for
Yeah.
our own project?
Well, aero barrier seems kind of like a really easy way to like finish it off,
Yep.
just set that up and like boom. Um, yeah. The other thing I'd be interested for you to speak about is, you also mentioned this really cool product out of, is it Lithuania, like the Eco Cocoon that uses like the compressed
Yeah,
straw?
straw. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I first ran across this product at the Passivhaus conference in Hanover. I think that was 2012. And there's a Norwegian architect, Bjorn Kierulf, who works in, I think it's Slovakia, and his firm is Createra. And he showed us this slide of this box, and it's basically you take 2x4s and build like a three-dimensional box. Let's say it's like 8 foot tall by 4 foot wide by 2 foot deep, and they have this machine that can take straw and basically compress it in two directions. The problem with straw bale is in one direction it's a little bit effective as a U value in your wall. In the other direction, it's kind of like a straw and it's not effective at all.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
What they're able to do is they kind of get this mix, where the straw is oriented in two directions, and
Hmm.
it's super efficient. The panels are easily handled by one or two people, or a small crane or lift if you need it. Uh, it's like fully decarbonized, right? Like there's no carbon in straw, and
Yeah.
2x4, 2x3 elements are not carbon intensive either. uh, it goes together super quick. Yeah, it's just like this really amazing way of building like this decarbonized uh, um, green building. And yeah, so I think it's either Lithuania or Latvia. I think it's Lithuania. And I heard recently that they were working on getting it licensed here in the U.S. So that it would be an option as well. But yeah, it's a fascinating material.
Yeah, it looks really interesting. That's I mean, before I was going to talk with you, one thing that was really heavy on my mind. This is maybe going back a little bit, but I've been thinking a lot about like kind of suburban sprawl in the United States, and how, what's eventually going to happen with all these houses when a potential collapse happens, and they are no longer sustainable, and we have all these houses full of like fiberglass and polystyrene foam and all these different kind of like petroleum derivatives and other types of things. What happens when that all deteriorates and we just have this like morass of different industrial products like returning back into the land. And so there's this question of like, oh, like, are there alternatives to this stuff, especially as far as like Passivhaus is concerned? Because as my initial understanding was like, oh, it's, you got to have all this like foam involved with it and all these other like specialized products. But it's really cool to see like all of these things that are very, very simple, or organic agricultural products being used in these like Passivhaus buildings. Um, the other cool one you talked about was like the cork insulation.
Yeah.
Maybe you could just mention a little bit about that too.
Yeah. So a couple of years ago, this is probably about a decade ago, a buddy of mine who is a Passive House product supplier, now based in Vancouver, BC, showed us this cork insulation product, and we were like, "What the heck is this?" And so what it is the wine industry doesn't harvest cork for bottles to the degree it used to, and so you have all of these cork trees in Portugal, and that cork has to be harvested, or the tree basically suffocates and dies.
Hmm.
And so there's this company called, I think it's Thermocork. They collect the cork, and they kind of crumble it up into little pellets, and then heat and compress it, and it expands.
Hmm.
And it's low carbon. Uh, it's moisture resistant. I think there are elements that are fire resistant, and so you can use it as an exterior insulation in lieu of like a petroleum based rigid foam, and you can also use it as a siding as well. It comes in higher densities, and so it's this super incredible project or product. We tried to use it on a project a number of years ago, and the project didn't go through, which I was super bummed out by.
Hmm.
But uh, it yeah, it's there are so many innovative things going on in the construction industry, and so little of it feels like it's happening here. So
It seems like it's all happening in Europe, right?
yeah, well, and in China too, like the passive house is seeing a massive uptake in China. There are maybe three or four passive house windows manufactured in the U.S.,
Hmm.
and a lot of those are frames that are manufactured in Europe and just assembled here. In China, they've gone from zero to like 130 in a matter of years. The largest passive house district in the world is in China. The number of passive house projects, I think, in development in China are just going to start blowing everyone away. And it's kind of by necessity, right? Like they have to have buildings that consume less energy. They're cold
For sure.
dominated. Their air quality is horrendous, right? So it's kind of like all of these reasons that we're building here in the U.S., or at least on the West Coast. I think we should be building the passive house. It's like taking up several degrees in China. So
Hmm. So I guess maybe to wrap up, maybe if you were to make like one recommendation to move us forward. I mean, we've talked about a lot of things here, but they obviously all intersect. Talk about mass timber, passive house, you know, multifamily Baugruppen. What do you think is like the next step that as a nation or maybe as different local municipalities need to take to move closer towards this type of vision?
yeah, that's super complex. I don't know.
Sorry, I
It's
gave
no,
that's a really
no.
hard one
It's
to.
the intertwining of all of them, right? So
Yeah.
like I've been thinking about this a lot lately. I'm super into a lot of the European eco districts right now. These big
Hmm.
mass timber, passive house eco districts with lots of open space and social housing, and we're not doing anything close close to that. I, I really don't know. I think that incentives will probably be the way we do this in the U.S. Right, like the energy codes are a decade out from being where Europe is right now.
Hmm.
And so we're not going to see whole scale increases in energy efficiency requirements in the next couple of years. But what we can see is we could, see jurisdictions offering, incentives, right, for projects that meet passive house or subsidies. It seems like that's really the way that things
Hmm.
change here. In Europe, a lot of the innovation is driven by kind of industry and government working a little bit in collaboration, and so there's kind of a carrot, right? They fund research and R&D on the academic side as well as the commercial side, but they also have the carrots, by 2023 all buildings have to have an LCA, so we have to know how much carbon you're actually emitting. which is going to drive more environmentally friendly structural elements, right? So the, there are a number of things that Europe is doing, I think, around circular construction, mass timber, right? The European Green Deal and the new Bauhaus are going all in on wood construction and circularity. I don't know how we kickstart that here in the U.S.
Well, I guess it probably starts with like trying to build something, right? That
Yeah,
can be a
we're talking we were talking to a couple of guys recently about kind of doing a little assemblage of mass timber passive house bow group, and as kind of like this demonstration project. Again, it's going to come down to financing.
yeah. If you can get the thing built, right?
Yep.
That's what
But I
it's all
think that
about.
if you can get it built, and Aaron's a developer. He's he knows how to work the pro forma. He's really comfortable with everything, and so he feels like we have a pretty interesting path forward. And if we do, then hopefully it's something that we could scale. And we're all about open source and knowledge share. And if it goes, I would love to see it take off everywhere. So
Yeah, that would be amazing. I'm definitely thinking about like how it might work in projects that I'm kind of considering. So I guess one more thing to ask is just if people want to like follow the development of this type of building technology, is there like a good place to go that kind of tracks um, these various things we've discussed here?
my Twitter feed.
Yeah, that's a good one.
The mass timber stuff. All of my sources for mass timber are German and Austrian.
Mm,
There are a couple of
you have to translate.
yeah. There, Google Translate is actually pretty effective. And I've been back from Germany for a little over a year now. I've definitely lost most of my vocab, and so I lean a little bit heavier on Google Translate than I wish. But it works really well. Um, so there's Proholtz Austria, or Proholtz.at is a good one.
Hmm.
For Baugruppen, there's actually Co-housing Berlin. Interesting enough, the Baugruppen community in Berlin has started calling itself co-housing. I think that's because of the large number of international residents that now
Ah,
live in
interesting.
Berlin,
Yeah, and they're like,
and,
what's
and
Baugruppen?
co-housing. Exactly right. And so here I am in the U.S. Like, I can't say co-housing. It's too granola.
yeah.
I'm gonna say Baugruppen, and then they've taken the opposite tack. So they have a number of projects that you can look on their website that are information. There's lots of information on how they connect people. The mass timber. There are a couple of mass timber websites in the U.S. The Wood Innovation Network, I think, is one. If you Google mass timber and you know see North America, a number of sites come up, and they've got news and information on projects. And then for Passivhaus, I would say the two sources are the NAPHN, the North American Passivhaus Network, is pretty good. And they also run, trainings. They've got a lot of pamphlets and stuff that you can download. The other one is a relatively new group of folks who I've known for a long time doing Passivhaus Accelerator. And they've got a number of it's podcasts, blog posts, interviews. They've got weekly tech sessions, happy hours. They've been pumping out a ton of information in a really short time period. I would say those are probably the two best for Passivhaus.
Very cool. I should probably mention too, you like recommended on this mass timber thing, some books on co-housing and Baugruppen. I've got the list here, so I can maybe include that. I'll mention them. You talk about Cohousing Inclusive, Building and Living in Communities, the Vienna Model, and Self-Made City. So I put those on my reading list. So I'll have to. Hopefully, I can get to those. And
Yeah, you might have difficulty finding Self-Made City. Someone asked me about it recently, and there were a couple of copies on Abe Books. Abe
oh,
Books.
okay,
Yeah, that was a great one. Kirsten Ring is she's published a lot on these communities, and a lot of it around Berlin, where they're super innovative and just like we talked about earlier, forms of living that no one in the U.S. is even thinking about. So
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I've mentioned the idea of like co-housing to a few people, like interest in starting something like that, and it's pretty funny how often I have people respond with saying like, "Oh, it sounds like a cult to me." So,
I get that. I get that quite a lot, and
oh, really? So you get that too? Okay.
yeah. Well, and then I use Passivhaus, Baugruppe, Mass Timber, Passivholz, right? These are all German.
Yeah.
And I think that there's this weird stigma that people see the German and just kind of their eyes glaze over. So I don't, it's everyone is always telling me to stop using the German words, right? But it's like they're so foundational to my identity as an architect that it's really hard to let it go.
Sure. They sound cool too.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, Mike, it was a really fun conversation. Thanks for hanging out with me today. Yeah, and there's like so much things I want to follow up on. So, yeah, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Brandon.
You've been listening to How to Be an Artist. To support this podcast, you can go to patreon.com/H2BNA.